which are fanfiction. Short story, A Friend in Need is a Friend Indeed. Written by Irene Marras. A friend in need is a friend indeed. A deep sigh escaped Riana's lips. Why on earth had she agreed to go to Novigrad with Cage, and alone at that? The entire trip, the man had either been singing his little songs or annoying Riana with his lame pick-up lines. The last straw had been when he suggested that they pretend to be lovers on their honeymoon in the city. No one would ever suspect a thing. Cage had said, winking. The leader of the Scoia'tael group had some official and secret business to attend to in the city, so he insisted that they needed a cover story in case anyone became suspicious of their presence in Novigrad. So when they reached the gates and the guards asked them what they were doing there, Riana spoke before Cage could say anything. My brother here has been a little dense since he got hit on the head with a horse's hoof. I brought him here so he can be examined at the hospital. The elf had a blank expression on his face when Riana grabbed him by the arm and started leading him deeper into the city. Come on, brother, she said when the guards were still within earshot. Let's take you to see the doctor. Once they were out of sight of the gate guards, Cage had snapped, a dim-witted brother. A lover would have been a much better idea. Riana had let go of the man and snorted, the role of a dimwit is much more believable in your case. Ouch. You may be beautiful, but you're devilishly sharp, the man had said, pretending to be offended, but there was a twinkle of amusement in his eyes. It keeps idiots like you away from me, the woman said and looked around. Where to now? I have a meeting, but unfortunately it's not a suitable place for delicate elven lady like you, the man said cheerfully. You just said that I am prickly as hell. Roses are beautiful too, even if they have thorns, Cage replied, but then he too looked around. How about I pick you up at the Golden Sturgeon? Do you know where that is? I do, but I'm going to Vulmerius Hospital. I'm going to see if I can get some medicine there in exchange for work. Come there. The elf raised his eyebrows. Sometimes I wonder about your work ethic. You should get a hobby. I could help you find something more meaningful to do, the man said suggestively. I have a hobby. You don't know how calming it is to pop boils. And compared to what you're suggesting, opening up a nasty abscess is a lot more fun. See you at the hospital. Riana didn't wait for Cage's response, but instead took off toward a nearby alley. Cage watched her go, sighed, and shook his head before setting off in the opposite direction, humming to himself. At the hospital, Riana was welcomed, not particularly warmly, but she wasn't turned away either. When she said she was a healer and that she could work in exchange to get some medicines, she was allowed to stay and work with students, studying medicine in Oxenfurt. Or at least that was the plan, but while setting a patient's broken leg, she heard a familiar voice behind her say, I didn't know you were a student now. I haven't seen you in class. Did you just sneak in with the group so you could hang out with the real doctors? The woman turned to look over her shoulder in the direction of the voice. A middle-aged man was walking closer, smiling. Hey, Joachim. What are you doing here? The woman asked, finishing the bandaging and turning to face the man. I work here. Part-time, that is. I also teach in Oxenfurt. But you didn't answer my question. Are you really a student? The man asked. If I went to study, it would only be so I could point out all the mistakes you make in class, the woman chuckled. I need some medicine that I can't find in the forest, and I asked if I could come work here in exchange, she explained. Joachim nodded understandingly. Well, you can continue working here with your abscesses and fractures, or you can come to my office to talk. A surgeon to a healer. I'll make sure you get all the medicine you need, whichever option you choose. Then the man stepped a little closer and continued in a quieter voice, I've started collecting all the strange things I found during autopsies. I've found some, shall we say, rather interesting items. Riana raised an eyebrow. Well, I'll have to see that. Joachim wasn't joking. On the shelf in his office were about a dozen spoons, wooden, silver, and metal, a couple of small tin soldiers, a lake pearl, a Gwent infantry soldier card, a silver ring, various small decorative items, and a tin whistle. I don't want to know where you found that whistle, the woman said with a grin. Joachim chuckled from behind his desk. Riana turned back to look at the collection and noticed a surgeon's knife among the objects. She picked it up. Did you forget this here? She asked. The man shook his head. I found it when I performed an autopsy on a dwarf who had died of complications due to old age. The family wanted an autopsy because the dwarf was quite wealthy and some of his relatives suspected that he had been poisoned in order to inherit his fortune. However, I found no evidence of poisoning, but I did find that scalpel encased in the man's intestines. According to the family, he had never undergone any kind of surgery, so the origin of the knife is a complete mystery. The woman raised the scalpel to her face and examined it with interest. Indeed, a mystery. She raised her finger and, before Joachim could warn her, Riana had tried the blade and cut her finger. Ouch, the elf groaned, even though she knew the wound would close in an instant. However, she couldn't tell the man that. The surgeon looked amused. Didn't they teach you at healing school that knives are sharp? As he spoke, however, he turned around and took some bandages and a bottle of denatured and purified alcohol, known as surgeon's spirit, from a shelf behind him and placed them on the table. Ha ha, very funny, the woman replied, taking one of the smaller bandages and wiping the blood with it before cleaning the wound with a cloth dipped in alcohol. The wound had almost closed, but for the sake of appearances, she had to bandage it so that the man wouldn't start wondering about anything. Joachim knew nothing of Riana's abilities, even though they had been friends since Joachim was an enthusiastic young student in Oxenfurt. He had once come with his fellow students to see Riana's performance when their group happened to be near the city. There, one of the audience members had suffered a medical emergency. Joachim, who had only just begun his studies, didn't know how to help, but he helped Riana, who had immediately come to the rescue. They had become friends after that evening, and Riana always stopped by to say hello to her friend when she was in Oxenfurt or Novigrad. Riana was finishing bandaging the wound when there was a knock at the door. Come in, Joachim said. The door creaked open and a tall, slender man entered, his features sculpted and sharp, hiding something cold and observant behind them. Joachim, the man said, uttering the surgeon's name with a slight nod, but his gaze immediately lingered on Riana. The woman who was bandaging her finger made newcomer's nostrils quiver subtly. Something about her felt different. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew immediately that it was coming from the elf woman. Hubert, Joachim replied kindly, rising from behind his desk. It's unusual to see you here so late. I came to check on a case. A strange death, but more on that later. However, the man did not take his eyes off Riana. The way his eyes lingered on the elf's fingers, even though the wound had already been bandaged, was almost imperceptible, but Riana felt it. And this lady is... The man tilted his head slightly. Riana? An old friend, Joachim said casually, leaning against his desk. A healer. One of the few I wouldn't dare question if I were wounded myself. Riana lowered her hand, still feeling a slight tingling in her finger, even though the wound had almost completely healed. She turned to look at the newcomer, assessing him. There was something strange about this man. But Riana couldn't put her finger on it. Riana, this is Hubert Ridge. He is the city's coroner and was once my teacher in Oxenfurt. It's a pleasure to meet you, Riana said slowly, but she did not extend her hand in greeting. She did not want a stranger to touch her. There was something about the man that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. I'm sure it is, Ridge replied, a thin, appraising smile playing on his lips, but then he turned to the other man. Joachim, I actually came to see you about a case, but it looks like we have another expert here. Joachim raised an eyebrow. A case, a strange death. Regis casually brushed his robe and continued in a soft, almost friendly voice. A healer's perspective might be useful. You too, Riana, might find something we haven't noticed. Riana looked at the man appraisingly. What do you mean? The cause of death is unclear, Regis replied, tilting his head slightly. No signs of a struggle, no evidence of poisoning, but still. Something's not right. He let his words hang in the air for a moment before adding, almost casually, I've heard from Joachim that you're quite skilled at making diagnoses. Maybe you'll see something we haven't noticed. Joachim glanced at Riana with a raised eyebrow. Sounds like Hubert really wants your opinion. Riana didn't answer right away. Two conflicting emotions arose within her, curiosity and uncertainty. She was used to examining strange illnesses and injuries, but there was something different about this. Show me the body, she said finally, a small smile playing on her lips. Let's see if I can help. The man led her through the hospital corridors. Joachim had been busy filling out paperwork, so he hadn't been able to come with them. This made Riana nervous. There was something about Regis that she didn't like. As they walked, the man sniffed his nose. So, you were Joachim's teacher. You look a bit young. I would have guessed you were about the same age. I spend most of my time in the morgue. Working with embalming fluids has had a strange effect, the man replied quickly, as if he had memorized the answer. The explanation seemed made up. Could it really be true? She had never heard of anything like that before. However, she didn't want to start arguing with Regis. They reached the stairs leading downstairs, and Regis started walking down. Riana, however, paused for a moment. Noticing that she wasn't following him, the man stopped and turned to look at her. What's wrong? For some reason, the elf's legs refused to move for a moment, but she forced herself to smile. I realized I completely forgot to ask Joachim about the medicine. He promised to give it to me. Maybe I'll go get them first. Just in case this takes longer than expected and Joachim leaves. Regis looked at the woman for a moment, his head tilted, his hands behind his back, and then slowly walked back up the stairs. It shouldn't take long. And I can give you the medicine you need. As he spoke, the man had taken Riana by the arm and was looking at her intently. The touch made the woman's skin crawl, but she tried to hide her reaction. The elf saw the man's nostrils quivering strangely. Come, Regis said, and started to lead her down the stairs. Riana, my dear friend. What a pleasant surprise, a voice suddenly came from behind them. Regis' grip on the woman's arm loosened as soon as Riana turned around. Never had the elf been so happy to see the friendly and intelligent face of Emiel Regis Rohellec Terzieff-Godefroy. Dressed in his familiar grey travelling clothes, the man stepped closer, clutching the strap of his shoulder bag. Regis, Riana said, unable to hide the relief in her voice. What a surprise, and a very pleasant one at that. You have a knack for showing up at confusing moments. One would think you were following me, the woman chuckled. She walked toward the man, or rather half ran, and held out her hand in greeting. Regis shook the woman's hand warmly with both of his. I don't come to town very often, but I happened to be in the area and thought I'd drop in to see some old acquaintances, the man said, then turned his attention to the other man. Regis, he greeted with a nod, but the warmth in Regis's voice had quickly disappeared. The other man nodded with a neutral expression, but something still seemed to have changed. There was a strange tension in the air. You know each other? Small world, Riana said after a moment of silence. Then she turned to Regis, We were just on our way to the morgue to look at a body that died under suspicious circumstances. Want to come along? You might be able to help diagnose the cause of death." Regis smiled half-heartedly. "Not exactly what I had planned for my evening, but okay." Regis sniffed again, but then nodded. "All right." He turned and headed down the stairs. Riana glanced back at Regis, smiled, and then followed the other man with Regis at her side. The morgue did indeed smell strongly of embalming fluid. Regis was already standing next to the body, which was covered with a sheet. When Riana and Regis came closer, he lifted the sheet. It was a young woman, probably in her early 20s. As I said, no signs of a struggle, no signs of poisoning, and no obvious signs of any illness. Riana leaned closer. She was used to making diagnoses on living people, so this was new to her. And now that she had relaxed after Regis' sudden appearance, she could concentrate properly on solving the mystery. She examined the woman first without touching her. That's why she didn't notice the men staring at each other in the dark, their eyes gleaming, as if sizing each other up. "When did she die?" "She was found this morning," Regis replied, lowering his gaze to the body. Riana grabbed the woman's hand and, as she had expected, it was still stiff with rigor mortis. She let go of her hand and began to press on the woman's neck. Then her fingers touched something at the back of the corpse's neck. "Regis, can you help me?" The man stepped closer. "Let's turn her over," Riana said. Regis helped the elf gently turn the body so that they could see its back. The woman moved the dead woman's hair so she could see her neck. And there she saw them, bite marks, hidden under the hair. As Riana leaned in to examine the back of the neck, Regis slowly straightened his back and turned to look directly at Regis. His eyes flashed for a moment, almost imperceptibly, and the expression on his face was completely calm, but there was something that made Regis' eyes narrow. The silent conversation between the two vampires needed no words. "He is under my protection." Regis was no fool. He did not look away immediately, but Regis saw a slight, subtle tension on his face. As if he had just realized he had made a mistake. Regis brushed his sleeve lightly, as if the gesture could wipe away the threat that had filled the air in that moment. But Regis knew that the message had been received. Could this have something to do with the cause of death? Riana asked, examining the marks with her head tilted. Regis glanced at the marks from the other side of the slab. Perhaps. Regis and Riana laid the deceased back on his back. What could they have done to her? The woman wondered aloud. There are many possibilities. She was found on the outskirts of town. Perhaps a wild animal was involved, Regis said. Possibly, Regis said, his gaze now on the other man. Maybe some kind of ferocious beast. Regis smiled but said nothing. For a moment, Riana looked from one man to the other, but then shrugged her shoulders. Well, I don't think I can be of any more help. I'm no zoologist. But I have to go get those medicines from Joachim now. Regis turned his gaze to his companion, glanced at Regis, then looked back at Riana. He nodded slightly. It was interesting to meet you. A cold shiver ran down Riana's spine again as the man sniffed. Right. Goodbye. She turned to leave, but Regis suddenly placed his hand on her arm, his gaze still fixed on Regis. I'll come with you, my dear friend. The man emphasized the last words strangely, and Riana raised her eyebrows. Neither of the men said anything else, so Regis turned and looked at the woman with a smile. So you're going to meet Joachim von Gratz. He's a very skilled surgeon. I wouldn't be surprised if he became the head surgeon at this hospital one day. Me neither, Riana chuckled as they walked up the stairs, away from the smell of death and embalming fluid, leaving Regis standing in the shadows, his eyes gleaming. And when they reached the top of the stairs, Riana felt as if she could breathe freely again, completely unaware of how close she had just been to death.